Oliver Sacks, a neurologist, died fairly recently. And among the many unusual case studies described by Oliver Sacks, one of them focused on a young man's slow recovery from a brain tumor that seemingly had erased his memory and rendered him largely unresponsive to the people and to the stimulus around him. The name that Sacks gave to this particular case, this particular story, was The Last Hippie. And subsequently, it was made into a feature film that was entitled The Music Never Stopped. Anyone seen that? Okay. That movie played for a brief time at a few independent theaters, where my wife and I saw it, Sundance in Madison. And then we liked it so well that we subsequently programmed it for a film series that we teach at Madison, a film lecture series. Now this was a low-budget independent film, and so because it had no big-name actors, it didn't garner a lot of attention after it was released. But I found it to be a wonderful story about reconciliation and healing. This is how it goes. Gabriel is the only child of Henry and Helen Sawyer. And during his pre-adolescent years, Gabe bonds very closely with his father around music. The music of Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, the big bands. However, during his teenage years in the late 1960s, Gabriel turns to rock music, and together with some of his friends, he establishes his own little rock band. And his political views also begin to diverge sharply from those of his rather conventional and conservative father. And ultimately, the two, father and son, have a serious falling out over the Vietnam conflict. And amidst his mother's tears and his father's bluster, Gabe storms out of the house vowing that he will never come back. And he never does. Years pass without any communication whatsoever. But then, one day, the Sawyers receive a phone call. Gabriel, now homeless and confused, has turned up, and he must undergo delicate surgery to remove this massive brain tumor. And so the family at last has been reunited. But in the weeks that follow, Gabe's affect remains vacant, and he speaks only in monosyllables. And when normal rehabilitation proves unsuccessful, a young female psychologist urges the family and Gabe's treatment team to use music as a therapeutic device. Well, having exhausted all other options, the team begins to expose Gabe to various styles, various genres of music, including those old songs that his father enjoyed so much during Gabe's growing up years. Gabe listens to all this various music and remains completely unresponsive. That approach, too, seems to be a dead end. But then, quite by accident, one night, Gabe hears this stray passage from an old Beatles tune. And voila! He becomes animated, chattering excitedly about the song and his love for the Beatles. And over time, and in fits and starts, Gabe learns to communicate again. He struggles to resurrect and to retain these old childhood memories. His power of recall, however, has been permanently impaired. So he is still disabled, but we understand at this point he's been given a new lease on life. Now, as Gabe copes with his medical condition, his father, Henry, is fighting his own demons because he has never been able to accept his son's rejection of the elder man's musical tastes and his political views. In a real sense, after all these years, he is still angry. And even as Gabe begins to regain his function, thanks to rock music, Henry vigorously opposes the entire protocol. And he only relents when his wife, Helen, delivers to him an ultimatum. And so grudgingly, Henry begins listening to the songs that his son loves so much. And then he begins taking the records to the rehab facility and playing them for Gabriel. And they listen to the music together. And for the first time in their adult lives, they begin tentatively to discuss the past. those harmonious early years as well as the contentious years that split the family apart. And listening to his son, really listening, Henry begins to gain fresh insight into his thinking, into his musical ethos. And appreciation begins to follow growing understanding. And so in the movie's final scenes, we see father and son dressed in these colorful tie-dye shirts attending a raucous Grateful Dead concert. Both of them responding enthusiastically to the beat of the music. Stop, look, listen. This, in a nutshell, is the process that many of us have to go through in order to get the most out of our relationships, and as a result, to live with greater self-awareness. Now, the sequence of these three actions, that may not necessarily always play out in the same way. The sequence may shift. And so in the case of the Sawyer family, it would be stop, listen, look. So when we are stuck in old self-righteous patterns of thinking and judging, nothing positive or transformative can happen until we are brought up short. We have to stop first. We have to stop or be stopped. And even after his prodigal son had been returned to him gravely injured, Henry Sawyer kept traveling along the same old well-worn grooves. He knows what real music sounds like. And either Gabe is going to come to his senses or he's going to have to remain in that semi-comatose condition. And so Henry angrily dismisses the work of the psychologist who had found the musical key that can unlock Gabriel's brain. But until that point, Helen, Gabe's mother, has remained, well, pretty much in the background, deferential and passive in the face of her husband's militant resolve. But she desperately wants to have her son back. And she realizes, unlike her husband, that this unusual therapeutic approach may represent their best and last hope for him. And so Helen plays her trump card. Henry, I am going to leave you if you don't change your attitude and give this therapy a chance. Her husband is blown away. He is absolutely stunned because perhaps for the first time in their life together, Henry's wife has challenged him directly, and he stops. We can't really look and listen properly with due depth and sensitivity unless we first bring ourselves to a halt. And this is where the practice of meditation can make a real difference in lives where we feel like we are constantly busy, constantly on the go. Because meditation is, first and foremost, from my own lengthy experience with it, it is first of all about stopping, putting the brakes on in order to be present for and fully aware of what the external environment and our own inner voices are trying to tell us. And this is by no means an easy task, because most of us are so caught up day by day in our agendas and our busy schedules. But it is ever so important that we try to do so. The Canadian physician and an expert on parent-child dynamics, a man named Gabor Mate, he draws a very critical distinction between attachment to another person, particularly to a child, and attunement to that person. Most children and parents, he says, form an attachment. But because they have so much trouble stopping what they are doing and bringing their full and undivided attention to the relationship, they never become attuned. They never really get on the same wavelength. To understand where another person is coming from, we have to first learn how to stop ourselves, bring ourselves to a halt. Gabor says that parenting is really not about techniques. Parenting is about the relationship. You can read all the latest books, but if your relationship with your child is not well established because you're too stressed, you're too busy, you're too involved with your career, then even the best techniques will not work. Personal example. For me, this was a big issue during the first decade or so of my ministry. Before coming to Madison, I was serving a church in upstate New York. And I would be sitting in my office at work, deep in concentration, working on a sermon maybe, and someone would knock on the door. Well, I knew better than to simply say, "Go away, I'm busy." Because after all, I mean, I'm a minister. I'm supposed to be available with my parishioners, right? But it did bug me. The interruptions bugged me. These visitors interrupted my train of thought, and although I never said, vocally, "Get lost," that message was undoubtedly communicated through my tone of voice and through my body language. As Anne Lamott once put it, if the devil can't get you to sin, he'll keep you busy. But eventually, and with the help of some critical, candid feedback and a growing meditation practice, I was able to change my demeanor and my expectations of myself. I also gained the ability, after a while, to return to the task at hand even after a lengthy interruption. We can learn to stop. So let's talk about listening. Good listening is an art, as most of us know. But much of what passes for conversation in our daily lives would better be described as intersecting monologues. I take my turn, you take your turn, but the threads of our conversation are never woven together because each party is more interested in what he has to say than what she has to say. And so according to Kay Lindahl, careful, attentive listening is the hallmark of true hospitality, true kindness to one another. Because when a person knows that they have our full and undivided attention, they really feel cared for, affirmed in their humanity, their personhood. None of us really listen enough, do we, dear? Father Joe, an English Benedictine and spiritual counselor, once remarked. We only listen, he says, to a fraction of what people say. But you know, listening, that's a wonderfully useful thing to do because you almost always hear something that you didn't expect. Moreover, Father Joe continues, we must listen because we are so often wrong in our certainties. This is precisely what Henry Sawyer, once he had been forced to stop, what he discovered. When he had no choice, thanks to his wife, but to engage with his son, Henry began listening more closely to the rock songs that for so many years he had simply dismissed as incoherent noise. And then as he and Gabe listened to these same songs together, the father began to find his son's enthusiasm infectious. He got curious. Gabe, what's that song about? I don't get it. And Gabe would sit back and he would patiently explain to his father the composer's message that the father was having so much trouble grasping. But as he gained insight from these conversations, Henry finally was able to step into his son's world and to locate the source of their original estrangement. He became attuned to his son. Now, Henry had an advantage that many of us probably don't have or maybe didn't have earlier in our life. Because following many years of faithful service to the firm that he worked for, he was summarily laid off. He was forced into early retirement. And after the initial shock and anger with his firm wore off, well, this turned out to be a fortunate fall because Henry now had plenty of time to learn this new musical language that his son was teaching him and to reconnect with Gabriel. That's not a luxury that a whole lot of families have. But there are latent opportunities in every household for developing that greater attunement. Yes, many of us are pressed for time. But if you cannot carve out more time, stretch those 24 hours in your busy day, family therapist Bill Doherty says that we need to try to use the time that's already available and use the activities we're engaging in on a daily basis more effectively. And so hypothetically, everyone has to stop what they're doing for nourishment, to eat a meal. So make sure that when your family meal is served, everything else stops. No TV, no texting, no scanning your social media. All families establish these patterns of behavior, rituals that members follow more or less out of habit rather than intentionality. And these can be changed if the stakes are high enough, if the payoff is believed to be important enough. A greater degree of mutual understanding and appreciation gained through casual but respectful family banter That creates attunement. And it seems like it's enough for us to make the effort. Stop, listen, and look. Listening paves the way to looking. And what I mean by this is looking squarely at ourselves. In that reading from Charlotte Joko Beck that I shared earlier, she talked about all those different channels, all those various storylines that our minds create and that then color our perceptions of one another. Without self-awareness, we always imagine that the source of our content or our discontent, our pleasure or our pain, is out there, that it has to do with those other people, and not with the frequency that we ourselves happen to be on at the time. And Joko Beck suggests that in order to really know another person, we have to get a better handle on our channel guide. Some people live out their lifetime, she said, and they never really meet. Their channels meet once in a while, but they never do. And that's precisely what occurred with Gabriel and Henry. Because the father was held captive by what the Buddhists call fixed views. Fixed views. A couple of comfortable channels continually supported and reinforced Henry's worldview. And it was very discomforting for him to consider or to be exposed to the channels that his son actually preferred. And so it was downright painful for Henry to listen to his son and to give credence to his own experiences. But then even though he ended up hearing a lot of things that caused him to feel deep sadness and regret, Henry kept at it. He persevered. He forced himself to listen without judgment, and ultimately he was able to look back at himself, recognize his prejudices, see himself in a brand new light, not as the villain of the piece, but as the product of a culture that had never required men like him to really listen. And so Henry acquired insight into the underlying sources of his intolerance, and as a result, he began to see new possibilities for himself. He didn't have to be so self-protected. His thinking and his imagination could expand beyond those few preset channels that he'd restricted himself to for decades. And so it was, with the least amount of self-consciousness, Henry accompanied Gabe to that concert, a concert that would bring him happy memories for years to come. As we endeavor to practice with our relationships, Charlotte Joko Beck says, we begin to see that those relationships are our best way to grow. In those relationships, we can see what our mind, our body, our senses, our thoughts really are. Why are our relationships such excellent practice? Because aside from formal sitting in meditation, there is no way that is superior to relationships in helping us to see where we are stuck and what we are holding on to. As long as the people in our relationships are pushing our buttons, we have a chance to learn and to grow. So a relationship, she says, is a great gift. Not because it's going to make us happy, because often our relationships don't make us happy, but because any intimate relationship, if we can view it as a spiritual practice, is the clearest mirror that we cannot put up before ourselves. And so the music never stops. The movie ends with Gabe and his mother walking out of a cemetery. Walking out of a cemetery after the interment of Henry's body. Henry had already suffered one heart attack, but not long after he and his son watched the Grateful Dead perform in concert, Henry was felled by a second coronary. That one proved fatal. And before the lowering of the casket, a boombox is turned on, and a final musical salute is played for the deceased. Touch of Grey by the Grateful Dead. I know the rent is in arrears. The dog has not been fed in years. It's even worse than it appears, but it's all right. I will get by. I will get by. I will get by. I will survive. And so because of what they learned by stopping and listening and looking, we know that not only Henry got by in the end, but that Gabe and his mother will also get by. They too will survive. Blessed be.